Hello, here I am with a new haircut and a new book to review. Today I'll be reviewing Mao II by Don DeLillo, which I'm very excited to review. I've been reading through some of Don DeLillo's works. I actually started with his short stories a couple months ago, read through his collection, The Angel Esmeralda, which is fantastic. I really loved a lot of the stories in there, but especially the ones he wrote between about 1985 and 1990. And actually, the two novels that I've read since then, White Noise and Mao II, the one I'm reviewing today, were written in that same period. White Noise came out in 1985, and it's probably Don DeLillo's most famous work. Of the ones I've read, which again, between his short stories and Mao II isn't much, it's definitely the most immediately accessible, and also it's the one whose influence I've seen the most immediately in what I guess you could call postmodern or new sincerity authors like David Foster Wallace and Zadie Smith and so on. 1985 was White Noise, and that was DeLillo's 9th novel, which is pretty wild to think about, that it took 9 novels before he finally launched into the spotlight. Mao II is 2 novels after White Noise. After White Noise is Libra in 1988, and then Mao II in 1991. So this is the 90s. Here we are now. Entertain us. I didn't even plan that, but it worked perfect. Mao II by Don DeLillo begins its joke with its title. Mao II is also a work or a series of works by Andy Warhol. It's the classic Andy Warhol treatment given to a portrait, where he takes a photo of Mao and reproduces it over and over and over and over again with different filters and different dashes and splashes of color here and there, so that at the end of it you have a big collage of different Maos that I guess correlate to form Mao II. Warhol does this with a lot of images, from soup cans to Marilyn Monroe. They're very iconic. In fact, he turns what are already iconic photographs and artifacts into things that become almost transcendent, making the mass of images correlate into one transcendent image. So when I say Mao II by Don DeLillo, we're already engaging in a joke. And the joke is one pretty common in postmodern works of literature and art, that Mao II, the words, signify multiple things at once. And we're to engage with both Mao II as Andy Warhol's piece and Mao II as Don DeLillo's novel. Even if you haven't read White Noise, you've probably heard the premise. In fact, I just learned that it's going to be made a Noah Baumbach movie starring Adam Driver and Greta Gerwig, which, having read the book, unfortunately makes a lot of sense. But the plot of White Noise, as the back of the book will tell you, actually the back of the book doesn't, it's like kind of sad how, the back cover of this book is the book in a way, in the sense that I feel like people really boil it down to this back part of the book, which is not the book, but it basically is. It's like a stand-in. The last paragraph of the back of the book reads, "A lethal black chemical cloud floats over their lives," the Gladney family's lives, "an airborne toxic event unleashed by an industrial accident. The menacing cloud is a more urgent and visible version of the white noise engulfing the Gladney family: radio transmissions, sirens, microwaves, ultrasonic appliances, and TV murmurings, pulsing with life, yet suggesting something ominous." That's the back cover of the book, folks, so you don't need to read the book. But actually, White Noise's premise is pretty popular. A lot of people know it. They know it has something to do with consumerism and something to do with that being manifested in a cloud, a toxic waste cloud. Technology bad, people stupid. But that's really not what White Noise is at all, having read it. It's a meditation on death that uses irony and humor to distance ourselves from death so we can talk about it. Really, the white noise isn't something that inherently takes over people's lives and invades and is scary. Really, what's going on is we're just not dealing with the reality that we're mortal, that we're going to die. And so DeLillo is playing with that idea of white noise as a means of distraction from what's right in front of you, which is your own mortality. So we have such a great premise in White Noise. What's Mao II about? Is Mao frozen and he's going to come out and lead the second cultural revolution? Not at all. Mao II is actually remarkably difficult to summarize, to describe. I guess you could say it's about a writer who is reclusive. And you could say it's about this writer's work associates, but not his family. We don't really talk much about his family, but we talk about the weird people around him. It might be helpful actually to view this novel in relationship to White Noise. In fact, we can look at the first paragraphs of these books and see how they're extremely similar in a lot of ways, but they're also profoundly different. And I'm gonna argue that White Noise basically embodies the style that many contemporary writers, such as David Foster Wallace, I think most obviously, is copying, borrowing, emulating. White Noise is the style, but Mao II is the substance. Mao II is the sentiment, that kind of cynical distrust with a humanistic twist. So looking at White Noise, I would love to read the first lovely paragraph, or at least part of it. It begins, "The station wagon arrived at noon, a long, shining line that coursed through the West Campus. In single file, they eased around the orange I-beam sculpture and moved toward the dormitories. The roofs of the station wagons were loaded down with carefully secured suitcases full of light and heavy clothing, with boxes of blankets, boots and shoes, stationery and books, sheets, pillows, quilts, with rolled-up rugs and sleeping bags and bicycles, skis, rucksacks, English and Western saddles, inflated rafts." This goes on, a long list of items. And the kind of omnivorous, the all-consuming nature of the mass of these college students coming to campus once again in the fall is a wonderful description of what's going to come in the novel, of masses, of big groups of people trying to hide themselves from their mortality. Mao II begins kind of similarly, actually. We have a very similar scene, but in a radically different context. Instead of the new arrivals to college, we have the newlyweds. But the newlyweds includes multiple couples. As Mao II begins, "Here they come, marching into American sunlight. They are grouped in twos, eternal boy-girl, stepping out of the runway beyond the fence in left center field. The music draws them across the grass, dozens, hundreds, already too many to count. They assemble themselves so tightly, crossing the vast arc of the outfield, that the effect is one of transformation. From a series of linked couples, they become one continuous wave, larger all the time, covering the open spaces in navy and white." The beginning of Mao II opens up with a mass wedding performed by the Moony guy, who I know his name is Moon, Master Moon, the Reverend Moon, and he becomes tangentially important throughout the book. But I like how both of these novels begin with a big group of people engaging in the same thing, arriving at college, getting married. What does it signify? Well, a lot. Mao II, a lot more explicitly than White Noise, deals with this concept of the masses. I think if we were to talk about things that are similar between White Noise and Mao II, it's that they both have humor, albeit dark. I think White Noise's humor is kind of punchy. It's very rooted almost in physical humor. There's a sense of physical comedy in White Noise and situational comedy. White Noise's comedy feels a lot like a sitcom in that we have these familiar situations that are repeated with different backdrops, and we see over and over again how these people are just kind of absurd and that we should be laughing at them, but then we're laughing at ourselves the moment we laugh at them. Mao II also kind of has a situational comedy thing going for it, but it's not as punchy. I think there's some similarities between the dialogue in that, I mean, you're constantly being called by the narrator of the book to see how idiotic certain people behave and how kind of inauthentic a lot of professional, both writers and people who assist writers in their jobs, how they're kind of not really doing what they think they're doing. They're turning right to go left, or something similar to that. But perhaps the biggest similarity between these two books, although they go in very different directions, is the theme of masses and death. So in White Noise, the masses are pretty benign. It's just like all of humanity is here and we're doing everything we can to not think about death. Mao II, on the other hand, I appreciate it because Mao II takes the gesture and goes another step. I don't want to do spoilers, but the narrative of Mao II centers ultimately on a writer wanting to do something humanistic, a writer who, for some reason, feels called to make a essentially celebrity appearance overseas to show his support for a writer. And this is going to not only be a nice thing to do because this other writer is in a hostage situation, so he's going to read some of his poems, I believe, in Beirut or London. So on the one hand, the main character of Mao II, who's a reclusive writer, thinks to himself, well, it would help my publicity if I went and read this poem by a writer who's taken hostage in Beirut, and at the same time, I can do something humanistic for once in my life and help somebody out. And I appreciate what Mao II does with this theme of the masses. It makes it global. So in White Noise, we're very much dealing with American masses, American group thought, American tribalism even. Whereas in Mao II, we're dealing with it on a very broad world scale. And I think the title and the recurring images of Mao remind us that this notion of the masses kind of controlling the direction of humanity is ultimately something we find more on a global level. It's not something unique to America or isolated in America even. It's not even something Americans have experienced through revolution, like in Northern Africa or the Middle East or in China. So DeLillo is constantly calling our attention to the globalized nature of the world in Mao II. And that's about where the similarities end, in my opinion. The difference is there are some that are pretty immediately obvious, such as who's narrating. In White Noise, we have the main character, Jack Gladney's narration as a first person, and he's very straightforward. He's very easy to read. On a sentence by sentence level, White Noise is an enjoyable and easy read. Really, it is. Which sounds strange for a highly acclaimed postmodern novelist to say that, but it's true. White Noise is a very enjoyable book, and we see that on a sentence by sentence level. Mao II, on the other hand, takes on a third person narration, and the tonal shift this creates is immense between White Noise and Mao II. I was kind of shocked in a way. The narrative voice in Mao II imbues the different characters, so sometimes we get their thoughts without quotes imbued into the narrator's voice. Similarly, the characters in Mao II kind of intermingle and blend. We can see the theme of the masses taking shape in the novel itself when characters are having a discussion and there's no indication or very clear indication about who's speaking when. And there might be 3+ characters and it's intermingling and all these people sound the same, and you start to wonder, okay, does it actually matter if I don't know who's speaking? Are they all thinking on similar terms and that's the point? You can wrestle with yourself to see if that's the point, but in any case, it's very enjoyable and it's so well written. That's the other thing I was struck by in Mao II. Because White Noise, again, it's very enjoyable on a sentence by sentence level, so you don't always appreciate the beautiful sentence because you're just enjoying the ride. Whereas Mao II, it's a little more heady, it's a little more intellectual, I suppose, which I don't like using that word intellectual. I'm not trying to gatekeep the book. I think you could enjoy it. Try White Noise first, though. I think it's a little more accessible and gives you an idea as to what you can expect in Mao II. But Mao II has those moments where the sentences become really crisp and the plot begins to move in a certain direction. You can feel these tonal shifts, and it's very satisfying to watch them. For all the critics of postmodernism or skeptics of postmodernism, specifically postmodern literature, who think that a postmodern novel has to be plotless and characterless or whatever, I mean, that's not true most of the time with great postmodern novels. Of course, there are exceptions, but Mao II and White Noise are great examples of just there's narrative, there's a solid plot, situational comedy, and heart-wrenching human stuff that gets your heart going. It's a very humanistic book. Although I think the Kafkaesque terror in Mao II is up to 11 as opposed to White Noise where it's like at 10. I realize now I've spent most of the time just talking about the difference between White Noise and Mao II. I really should just give my opinion on Mao II. I think the novel is fantastic, and I think it ultimately becomes, like I said, substantively very similar to postmodern or new sincerity contemporary authors working in America today. Whereas White Noise is cynical in the sense of how we usually use the word, and that is just kind of like, I don't care about anything, da 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 da. And it critiques everybody, and everybody's made fun of, and even the academy, the holy academy of scholarship out there for people who study English. It is attacked brutally, and it does not escape. But in Mao II, even though I think it's even more cynical, on an even more profound level, it is deeply skeptical. Mao II, taking the definition of cynicism really literally, is mostly distrustful of all systems of authority. It has zero trust in any group. It has zero trust in any faith. It has zero trust in any government, anything. But it has some kind of humanistic faith in the individual, in the lived bodily experience of one human. And this extends, I think, to multiple people over the course of the novel. But again, I don't think that Mao II, or White Noise for that matter, try to preach a sermon to you about how bad technology is and why we need to get off our phones, or that Don DeLillo is some prophet of the internet. I don't really think that, although I think you can point to certain things he was describing and say, hey, that's similar to what's going on today. Of course you can do that. You can do that with a lot of writers. But what Don DeLillo does in Mao II, I think, really well, is basically describe how strange the world is, how strange it is that we agree to be a part of these groups without even thinking about it, without even knowing it. Whether or not we choose to admit it or not, everyone pretty much in the United States operates according to group thought. Even if you think you're the most individualist, anarchist, cynic, chances are you got that way because of the internet and following other people, other academics, other writers as your influence. DeLillo's trying to call to your attention that there is no individual, just like how in Andy Warhol's portrait of Mao, there isn't Mao, there's Maos. Similarly, in Don DeLillo's work, there's never the individual. People are always associated with something larger than themselves, even if they wish they weren't, even if they wanted to, like the main character, hide from that aura, the notion that they're an extension, that they're a part of something bigger than themselves. You can't escape it. But I think that, much like the authors he would go on to influence, Don DeLillo in Mao II, as opposed to White Noise, begins to see that there is some kind of humanistic hope in turning towards not only yourself in a selfish way, but turning towards yourself and those immediately around you and showing love to them. There's a really heart-wrenching scene in Mao II where a character who's been spending time amongst the homeless in New York kind of has a breakdown and is trying their best to extend themselves to those who are suffering every day right underneath her, but she just doesn't see. It's a really heart-wrenching scene and one of my favorites in the novel, and much more touching, I think, ultimately, than the scenes in White Noise where the character finds out that his life can be summed up in ones and zeros on a computer. Mao II does have a humanistic heart to it. And the ending, I mean, gosh, I really love the ending of this book, but again, I don't want to spoil it. Another thing people might be interested in when they hear the premise of Mao II, or maybe they roll their eyes, is, oh great, a novel about a novelist, and then they, don't associate me. I think you can safely read this book and not have to worry about the classic author talking about themselves or author talking about writing to the point where it hurts. In fact, one of the things I really liked about Mao II, even though I did come away with it thinking this is in many ways a novel about the purpose and function of novels, is that the purpose and function of novels is not like on the surface exactly what you can take away. There's a lot you can take away from this book. But one of the ways Don DeLillo cleverly inserts this is just the image of Mao. Who is Mao? Well, in this book, Mao is not only a kind of icon of 20th century communism, group thought, the Cultural Revolution, cultural destruction, but he's also a writer. Mao is a poet. He's someone whose works children carried throughout the streets in China, and they recited and they memorized, like children today in America remember, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Mao was also a mythic figure. He was also a political leader. He was also a scholar. Mao seems to be this kind of everyman, and I think ultimately what DeLillo is challenging us to do is to reevaluate the novel as something just as important as we might view other people who use and abuse power to take advantage of groups. He's trying to say novels can do the same thing. Novels can take advantage of a group and define a group and force them into something they might not want to be associated with without them even knowing it. And this is all sounding very heady, and it is, and I apologize. But what I love about Mao II is that it calls attention to itself as a work of art, as a novel, but then critiques itself heavily and says, I'm just a novel. I'm just a collection of words on a page that just so happen to be beautifully arranged and moving, but I'm just a novel. And I think this is something that everyone can really take joy and pleasure in and come away from, honestly, feeling a little more enlivened. Although it is a sad book, although it is an upsetting book, it's oftentimes a book that pulls you back into the real world just as soon as you thought you were out of it. And I love how DeLillo handles this. Real historical figures are mentioned. I don't want to get into spoilers, but you might want to think about the history of the late 80s as you're reading this novel. Because that history on a global level, again, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, away from the United States, the world events that Don DeLillo was paying attention to and seeing come to life in this book and remind us there is a real world out there outside of these words, this string of words that, again, are just so happen to be beautifully arranged, but ultimately are just words. There's real lives at stake. So now you're probably at the end of this review thinking, what the heck, man, you didn't even talk about the book. I don't really know what to say other than it's a book that has to be read in order to be fully appreciated for what it is. It really can't be digested in a summary. The back of this book is much worse than the one for White Noise, although it does have, my edition does anyway, Thomas Pynchon saying something on the back, which is pretty funny because that sets you up for the premise in a lot of ways. In lieu of talking much about the book because it's so hard to talk about, why don't I just read a passage or two that I really liked? Again, Don DeLillo has a real love of words. You can tell the man is a master wordsmith. He not only has a vocabulary that allows him to use different types of words, scientific words and whatnot in the realm of fiction, but also he's just got such an eye for the small, tiny, mundane details that make all the difference in a character. I think this is most exemplary in his short stories, which I highly recommend. If you don't know where to start with Don DeLillo, just Google Don DeLillo short story, see which one comes up first and read it, because they are all fantastic, but he is a master at the tiny detail. I wanted to read this paragraph that really exemplifies this attention to detail I was talking about. It's a paragraph concerning the main character, the reclusive novelist Bill. It was a life consisting chiefly of hair that drifts into the typewriter, each strand collecting dust along its length and fuzzing up among the hammers and interacting parts. Hair that sticks to the felt mat the way a winding fiber leaches onto soap, so he has to gouge it out with a thumbnail. All his cells, scales, and granules, all his faded pigment, the endless must of all this balling hair that's batched and wadded in the works. Oof. Again, the man has a real sense of rhythm. I think you'll enjoy Mao II. I really did. I enjoyed it ultimately more than White Noise, although White Noise is definitely the most clearly influential in terms of style. I think Mao II, with its humanistic twist on this theme of the masses and death, really, the most serious of all themes, is ultimately more humanistic, ultimately more rewarding to those willing to sit with it. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Take it easy. Have a good one.